हम सबके अभिभावक माननीय कुलपति प्रोफेसर नागेश्वर राव जी को धन्यवाद देता हूं, उनका आभार व्यक्त करता हूं। उन्हीं के प्रेरणा से हम यह कार्यक्रम कर पाते हैं और हमेशा उनका सहयोग और मार्गदर्शन हमें मिलता रहता है। इसके अलावा मैं अपने स्वाधीनता संग्राम तथा प्रवासी अध्ययन केंद्र के निदेशक और इग्नू के माननीय समकुलपति प्रोफेसर सत्यकाम जी को भी धन्यवाद देता हूं, उनका स्वागत करता हूं। इन्हीं के कुशल निर्देशन में हम लगातार विभिन्न वक्ताओं को बुला करके यह कार्यक्रम आयोजित कर रहे हैं। हमारे साथ हमारे अन्य पीवीसी भी जुड़े हुए हैं, मैं उन सबका भी स्वागत करता हूं। आज के प्रमुख वक्ता के रूप में हम सबके बीच प्रोफेसर रंजन चक्रवर्ती जी उपस्थित हैं, जो कि जादवपुर विश्वविद्यालय में इतिहास के प्रोफेसर हैं और विद्यासागर विश्वविद्यालय के कुलपति भी रह चुके हैं। आज वह 75वें वर्ष में भारतीय राष्ट्रवाद और ऐतिहासिकता का पुनरावलोकन, इंडिया एट 75 रिविजिटिंग इंडियन नेशनलिज्म एंड हिस्टोरिसिज्म पर विशेष व्याख्यान देंगे। सर, मैं आपका स्वागत करता हूं, अभिनंदन करता हूं। हमारे बीच हमारे सामाजिक विज्ञान विद्यापीठ इग्नू के प्रोफेसर आदरणीय शशिभूषण उपाध्याय जी भी उपलब्ध हैं। आदरणीय उपाध्याय जी समाहार वक्तव्य देंगे, आपका भी स्वागत है। अब मैं एकदम विलंब न करते हुए आज के स्वागत भाषण और विषय प्रवर्तन के लिए अपने विद्यालय के माननीय समकुलपति प्रोफेसर सत्यकाम जी को आमंत्रित करता हूं।
Thank you, Dr. Sushil Kumar Tiwari ji. It is indeed my pleasure to have with us today Professor Ranjan Chakravarti. He is a renowned historian. I welcome him. I welcome my Vice Chancellor, Professor Nageshwar Rao, who is inspiration behind this Azadi ka Amrut Mohatsav, and he is encouraging us at every point of time to do such creative works. So I need his blessing. His blessing is with us, and so this program is here. I welcome my fellow Pro-Vice Chancellors, Professor Sumitra Kukreti ji, Professor R.P. Das ji, Professor Uma Kanjilal ji, and all dignitaries who are present here. And we are here today to listen to Professor Ranjan Chakravarti ji. The topic of today's deliberation is India at 75, revisiting Indian nationalism and historicism. And the concluding remarks will be given by our fellow colleague, Professor Shashibhushan Upadhyay, Professor of History in IGNOU, in School of Social Sciences. And I welcome all those who have joined us with various channels, YouTube and our Facebook and Gyan Dhara and Gyan Vani and Gyan Darshan and Swayam Prabha. Let me introduce Professor Ranjan Chakravarti. Professor Ranjan Chakravarti is currently Professor of History at Jadavpur University, and he was formerly the Vice Chancellor of Vidyasagar University, West Bengal. And he is a renowned historian who is teaching history at Jadavpur University, Kolkata. And he has also taught in Vishwabharati University, Shanti Niketan. He is also a Fulbright visiting professor at Brown University and recipient of the prestigious Charles Wallace Fellowship at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and Alexander O. Vietor Memorial Fellowship at Brown University. Professor Chakravarti is an acclaimed historian with a keen interest in environmental history and related areas, and he has worked on history of science and technology, and he is also a former member of the editorial board of the Global Environment. And Professor Chakravarti's major publication include A History of Modern World and Outline, Terror, Crime and Punishment, Situating Environmental History, Does Environmental History Matter? Random Notes on Modern History, Modern Indian History, Space and Power in History, Political Economy and Present, and a co-edited volume under his guidance, Natural Resources, Sustainability and Humanity, and Critical Themes in Environmental History. So this is his main work, and when we revisit our history or revisit any theme of the history, like Indian nationalism and historicism, so every time when we revisit, the new thing comes. History is like this. History is not that once written and forgotten, but history guides us in present and future also. So we have to revisit our Indian nationalism, our historicism again and again. And today we have the honor to listen to Professor Ranjan Chakravarti, and I humbly invite Professor Ranjan Chakravarti to speak on this occasion of Amrut Mohatsav. Professor Ranjan Chakravarti.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Satyakam, for your kind introduction. Am I audible? Can you hear me? Okay. I do not know how much time you are going to allow me, but roughly speaking, I shall need about 40 minutes.
No problem, sir. No. Yes, it is okay, sir. It is okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Respected Mr. Vice Chancellor, Professor Nageshwar Rao, respected Professor Satyakam, the Pro Vice Chancellor, other distinguished colleagues who are present, and research scholars, invitees, students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you. At the outset, I express my sense of gratitude for inviting me to the 37th series of webinar on the occasion of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. I would like to thank the Center for Freedom Struggle and Diaspora Studies for organizing this very interesting program today. My special thanks to Professor Satyakam, the Pro Vice Chancellor of Indira Gandhi National Open University, and the Director of the Center for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to speak before this learned audience. My talk this evening is specifically addressed to the question of historicism in India, particularly historicism as it developed, if it developed at all, in the pre-colonial era. It seeks to understand the linkages between nationalism and sense of history, because without nationalism, what we know as modern history does not exist. We are now standing on the threshold of a supposed new India. India at 75. After 75 years of Indian independence, it is high time to reassess and look back at the writing of Indian history, which appears to be somewhat handicapped by colonialism and subsequently by Marxism and other political intrusions. The deepest and the most damaging impact of colonial rule can be seen in the field of Indian historicism and historiography. Thus, at 75, we should reassess the lens, the particular tool through which we are doing our historical analysis. And we have inherited this tool or this lens from the colonial past. And there are other dominant historiographical trends in post-colonial India, including Marxism and postmodernism. we know that we have perhaps overdone Marxism while doing history. I give you one or two examples, a couple of examples. It was not necessary, for instance, to initiate a debate whether feudalism, a European category, existed in India or not, or whether Asiatic mode of production is a viable concept or not. We do not need any European idea to investigate Indian agrarian structure. That is my point, but we have overdone it perhaps. We have opened the gate of a controversy which is taught even now in the classrooms, in the undergraduate and postgraduate classrooms, whether feudalism existed in India or not. Feudalism from above, feudalism from below. You may not require Marxian thesis to understand Indian history and see everything in terms of class struggle. Now, the question that I'm going to raise this evening is something like this. Can there be an Indian history from the Indian or indigenous perspective? Though I am not very sure if this particular phrase, indigenous history, can be used or not. Was there an Indian nationalism before the rise of British rule? Because if you talk about history, then scholars will start saying that then we should also ask the question whether there was an Indian nationalism before the rise of British rule. Was there an indigenous perception of history, which follows from this question relating to nationalism? So this is roughly the synoptic note of today's lecture. It will help you to understand my talk this evening. The domination of the West in history writing had been so strong that even the histories of Asia, Africa, or Latin America appeared to be simply extensions or mere sub-themes under the broad headings of European or American history. To illustrate this point, we may need to focus on world history or global history or the history of the modern world. Let us take a look quickly at the transitional shape of world history or global history. The concept of a modern world or world history or global history continued to change through the ages with the growth of geographic knowledge, advancement of technology, and the evolution of philosophy of history. Many of you are aware of this. But the gathering of geographic knowledge or voyages of exploration alone did not shape the concept of the modern world or its history. There were other deeper underlying forces like religion, race, reason, enlightenment, or socialism, which contributed to the constructions of the modern world at different points of history. There were various shifts and turns in this structure or in this concept, in this entire concept of the modern world. And these turns and shifts came up at different points of history. We come across a large variety of world history. Why I'm saying this concept of world history or modern world is somewhat remotely connected to the question I raised at the outset. We come across a large variety of world history which finds manifestation in a large number of works, starting from the pre-modern period to the early 20th century. I give you some examples, very small number of examples. Sir Walter Raleigh, The History of the World, published in 1614. Karl Rotak, General History of the World, published in 1840. G.W.F. Hegel, Lectures on the Philosophy of History. John Fiske, The Unseen World and Other Essays, published in 1902. Edgar Sanderson, The World's History and Its Makers, published in 1902. James Bryce, World History, published in 1919. H.G. Wells, The Outline of History, published in 1920. A.J. Toynbee, A Study of History, 12 volumes, published between 1934 and 1961. Each of these works is written from a unique perspective and is dominated by divergent ideas of religion, race, philosophy, politics, and power relations. Hegel's lectures on philosophy of history, many of you are aware, is divided into two broad sections. The first section is the formal and theoretical part, in which Hegel shows in what way reason can be said to determine the course of history. The first part is purely theoretical in character. Now, in the second part, in the first section, it is the formal and theoretical part, in which Hegel shows in what way reason can be said to determine the course of history. The second and the more lengthy section, with subtitles, the Oriental world, the Greco-Roman world, the Germanic world, they test the theoretical ideas developed in the first section to actual historical data. The end product is a very Eurocentric kind of world history, the concept of modern world history that grew up in the post-Enlightenment period, therefore, could never escape from this hangover of the Eurocentric worldview. This is precisely why the American Indians, the Aboriginals of Australia or New Zealand, the indigenous people of Latin America, Asia, or Africa could never ever find a prominent place in the pages of this world history or in the broad framework of the modern world. Indian history or the history of Australian Aboriginals, they look like a mere footnote in this modern world history. This historiography bears the clear dominance of white Anglo-Saxon, Catholic, or Protestant males. This domination had been so strong that even the histories of Asia, Africa, or Latin America appeared to be simply extensions or mere sub-themes under the broad headings of European or American history. According to this historiography, Africa seems to be without any history before the European scramble and the establishment of colonial rule. The 19th century, or the pre-colonial century, as it has been called, loomed large in the post-Second World War effort to reinterpret African history. Recent research in African history has played down the importance of the colonial period as a watershed and argued in favor of a new African history from a fresh perspective. This is precisely the reason why African history in general is yet to find its way into the school and college curriculum in many parts of the world. And the same is true about American history, US history, and Australian history. There also, we don't find much about the Aboriginals. The fate of Asian history in general and South Asian history in particular too is almost similar. Much of the historiography of South Asian history was initially shaped by British imperialist historiography, which was geared by the British had to devise novel and exceptional theories of governance to moralize their rule in India. It was precisely with the object of providing legitimacy to their conquest that British imperialist writers were unusually harsh on pre-colonial Indian rulers and dubbed them as symbols of cruelty. They described the pre-British era as one of total chaos from which India was rescued by British rule. Henry Maine, the law member of the Viceroy's Council, in India, in his lecture at Cambridge University in 1875, implicated India with Britain somewhat paradoxically in a common origin, and yet was fundamentally different. Throughout the later 19th century, as they constructed their India, the British had always to negotiate this disjuncture between an acknowledgement of similarity and an insistence upon difference. Metcalfe argues that throughout the Raj, and especially during the years of uncontested British supremacy from 1858 to 1918, the ideas that most powerfully informed British conceptions of India and its people were those of India's difference. The Victorians set out to order and classify India's difference in accordance with scientific systems of knowing. The study of India was thus made part of a larger scholarly enterprise in which the Victorians, as children of the Enlightenment, sought rational principles that would provide a comprehensive and comprehensible way of fitting everything they saw in the world around them into ordered hierarchies. The existence of empire, by imparting a sense of urgency to the process, spurred on this creation of knowledge, and at the same time, the unequal power relationships of imperialism helped shape the categories within which that knowledge was constructed. The strategies devised by the British to comprehend India were never simply intellectual exercises. Through them, what the British conceived of as India's enduring difference was given shape in cultural and administrative practices. The idea of the modern world, which dashed out Asia, Africa, Latin America, or the original inhabitants of Australia or New Zealand, emanated from various such discourses on so-called modernity. But within this modernity, the broad stream of modernity, there was no room, no space for Asia, South Asia in particular. Indian history came up as an integral part of British history at one point of time. Modern Indian nationalism, we all agree, historians by and large agree, arose as a response to colonialism. As if before the rise of colonialism, there was no nationalism. There was no national identity. Modern political nationalism did not exist. It came into existence after the onset of colonial rule. Indian history also came up as an integral part of this national identity, political nationalism. If we follow this viewpoint, if we agree with this view that there was no nationalism, political nationalism before the rise of colonialism, and that nationalism arose as a response to colonialism, then it naturally follows that Indian history too developed as a crucial ingredient of this nationalism. So there was no history prior to the rise of colonialism, if we follow this argument. Now, interestingly, those of you who have read Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities, may know that if you have history, museum, and map, if you have history, historical writings, proper historical writings, some kind of a scientific history, then if you have museum where you have nationally identifiable artifacts, or if you have cartographic knowledge, only then you are capable of becoming a nation. The Indian and also European scholars rediscovered Indian past. It was during colonial rule that mostly European scholars rediscovered India's national heritage in art, architecture, literature, philosophy, and science, and the political achievements of great Indian rulers like Ashoka, Samudragupta, Chandragupta, Vikramaditya, and Akbar. This enabled the Indian nationalists to counter the imperialist propaganda to play down the political ability of the Indians. You know, I mentioned this earlier, that Indian rulers, the pre-colonial Indian rulers, were deliberately portrayed as cruel, as despotic. The Indian rulers were looked upon by the English as essentially cruel and inefficient. The historical researches undertaken by William Jones, Max Muller, Ranade, Haraprasad Shastri, Bhandarkar, and others infused into the Indian mind a new self-confidence. As political nationalism started to roll, there was a new self-confidence in the minds and hearts of the Indian people. It also enabled the nationalist leaders to arouse the self-respect and national pride of the Indians and thereby neutralize the imperialist propaganda. The rediscovery of Indian history thus fostered the growth of national consciousness. This is the conventional history of the rise of Indian nationalism and also the rise of modern scientific historical research in South Asia. I return to the question I raised in the beginning. But was there an Indian nationalism before the rise of the British rule? Was there an indigenous perception of history writing? Will it be possible to cultivate a history free from colonial bias? Now, it is widely held that India had no historical writing in the proper sense of the term. India lacked historical writing and a sense of history. All the nationalist historians have agreed on this point that India had no history before the advent of the British. I give you just one example. This is from Ramesh Chandra Majumdar. The same view is firmly maintained by Ramesh Chandra Majumdar, who is regarded as a nationalist historian. I am quoting one sentence from his book. Quote, "It is a well-known fact that with the single exception of Raj Tarangini, history of Kashmir, there is no historical text in Sanskrit dealing with the whole or even parts of India," unquote. So India did not have any historical sense. Indians produced oral traditions, mostly chronicles, biographies, eulogies, genealogical or dynastic records, etc. They serve these oral traditions and dynastic histories, etc. They serve as good sources for the construction of history, but they lack chronological precision and they cannot be regarded as scientific history. You know, the father of history, the historians study in methodology and historiography was Herodotus, was the Greek historian Herodotus. And the father of scientific history was another Greek historian, Thucydides, who was the author of the history of the Peloponnesian War. But if we think in terms of the Western standard of scientific history, then there was nothing which can be described as history in the Indian context. But these oral traditions and chronicles, they were transmitted through a long Dury period. But we cannot ascertain their exact timing. And the content of these texts, they vary. They fundamentally vary from each other. And these are produced and reproduced at different periods of time. Even this is true about our epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. You have different versions of Ramayana and Mahabharata. They do not tally with each other, with the variation of periods. It's very difficult to date them. So India lacked historical writing and a sense of history according to the Western assessment. We do not have scientific history, we are told. Bengal happened to be the main stage where everything started surfacing first. Nationalism, you hear the first national voices in Bengal, because Bengal was one of the earliest provinces to be exposed to the British rule. And the same thing is true about history writing. It was in Bengal and Maharashtra that you start hearing the historical voice. Historical writing started surfacing in Bengal first. Prabodh Chandra Sen has aptly described the period between 1804 and 1905 as the preliminary phase of Bengal's quest for historicism. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay played a crucial role in the opening up of the gate of historicism in Bengal. He wrote, I am quoting a sentence from Bankim Chandra, he wrote, quote, "There is a need for Bengal's history. Otherwise, there is no hope for Bengal. Who will write? You will write, I will write, everyone will write. Come, let us search out the history of Bengal. Unquote. প্রথম শিক্ষা বাংলার ইতিহাস, a Bengali book with the title, I'm translating the title, A Preliminary Probe into the History of Bengal, written by Rajkrishna Mukhopadhyay and published in 1874, may be regarded as the first noteworthy textbook on the history of Bengal. However, it failed to satisfy the aspirations of men like Bankim Chandra. That is precisely why Bankim Chandra had to give such an urgent call for a united effort to explore and record the history of Bengal. Now, Bankim Chandra was not alone in this project of writing Bengal's history. He was actively, in a later period, he was actively assisted by Rabindranath Tagore. Both Bankim Chandra and Rabindranath Tagore continued with this mission of writing Bengal's history. Sadhana, edited by Rabindranath Tagore, started publishing ancient copper plates on the one hand and articles on various interesting historical topics on the other. In 1893, Sadhana is a journal, started publishing Siraj-ud-Dawla serially. When the publication of Sadhana came to a halt, the serialization continued in Bharati. Siraj-ud-Dawla was published in book form in 1897. Rabindranath himself wrote a review article of the book in Bharati, wherein he commented, Bengali literature will remain ever grateful to him, Akhay Kumar Moitra, for emancipating the history of Bengal. Unquote. Akhay Kumar Moitra was instrumental in opening the gate of Bengal's history, and thereafter many others entered the arena through that gate. Among them, mention may be made of Kali Prasanna Bandopadhyay, the author of Nababi Amol, published in 1901, and Nikhil Nath Rai, the author of Murshidabad Kahini, published in 1907, and Murshidabader Itihash, 1902. Murshidabader Itihash means history of Murshidabad. This is the beginning of history writing in India, and I gave some examples from Bengal, but the same thing was happening in other parts of India at about the same time. Maybe Bengal was little ahead. So this is a time when nationalism, or a kind of a preliminary nationalism, has come to the surface in response to British colonialism. It is surfacing gradually in a dormant form. But what were nations like before the rise of nationalism? Was there an Indian nation? I'm returning to that question. To this, there is a flat answer. Many of you know this. There were no nations before nationalism. And this is coming from Max Weber. Simple, flat, simple reply. Can there be nations before the rise of political nationalism? The answer is flat no. There were no nations before nationalism. Max Weber seemed to come close to saying this, but he then spoke of communities of sentiments. He said that there can be no nations before nationalism. But having said this, he came up with a caveat. He talked about communities of sentiment which preceded nations. Communities of sentiments can precede nations. A nation is born when it perceives itself as such. When people start thinking that they belong to a nation, it's an imagined community, as Benedict Anderson showed in 1983. A nation is born when people perceive themselves as a nation. For all the objective factors that may assist it in this self-perception, this is in the last resort a mental process. This is a history of mentality, a structure of mentality. Its roots are to be found in the history of mentality. Modern nationalism was born out of civil society. Civil society, a society of individuals which runs implicitly counter to dissent groups, was the product of intellectual and political transformation of the Atlantic world in the 17th and 18th centuries. The American Revolution, to give a specific, concrete example. Nationalism, civil society, and the sovereignty of the people are but manifestations of the same process. A modern intellectual and political development that extended from Western Europe outwards to the Americas and the Indian Ocean. The emergence of the modern world has therefore to be viewed in terms of history of a mentality. Nationalism has then a prehistory, a history of sentiment. Nationalism is preceded by emotions and sentiments spanning an extended period of time. So this is a felt community. Max Weber is talking about, by communities of sentiment, he's actually meaning the existence of a felt community, which Weber called the community of sentiment. It was earlier referred to by Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, by the ancient term nation, which at one time was interchangeable with race or tribe or community. A tribe can be described as a nation, but this description of a tribe as a nation is in cultural terms, as Hegel did. Nations, I'm quoting Hegel, just one sentence, quote, nations may have had a long history before they finally reached the destination, that of forming themselves into states, unquote. For Benedict Anderson, Imagine Communities, published in 1983, the modern nation is an artifact, an imagined political community. The institution that fostered it was print capitalism. Very briefly, I touch upon this print capitalism. In the world today, we all live in a country, or what we call a nation state. In vernacular terms, a nation state is the territorial space where a nation lives. The state is the geopolitical space and its government. The nation is the community of people. You belong to a nation. We all belong to the Indian nation. So we are part of the community. But have you met everyone in this community? Do you think it's likely that you will meet everyone in your country in your lifetime? Probably not. So what makes you part of the same community if you will never meet each other? Perhaps it is just the fact that you imagine it. This is the idea behind the imagined community, a term defined in 1983 by historian Benedict Anderson, one of the most influential scholars to tackle the concept of national identity. According to Anderson, the nation exists because people believe it exists. Of course, the obvious question is this: how in the world did this happen? How did strangers suddenly decide that they were part of the same community? Anderson has an answer for that too, and it all has to do with printing. The rise of the printing industry in Europe, and with the effort of Johannes Gutenberg, you have printing presses, which used to print documents very fast. You have the vernacular Bibles. You know the history of European transformation. And what happened after one point, after the discovery of printing industry, and when printing industry became very viable, you find people in Europe not learning Latin anymore, but they are learning local languages, French, German, English, and different local languages. They started to publish newspapers. And the local newspapers were read by the local people, and the local people, they started developing some kind of an identity. They imagined that they belong to a community, and they begin to picture themselves as a community, and finally they came to imagine that they belong to a nation. That is how nationalism in Europe started flowering. This, according to Anderson, is the root of the nation state. Print media, particularly newspapers, was the foundation that allowed people to start seeing themselves as a unified nation. Benedict Anderson calls this entire idea print capitalism. This entire idea, how finally there was a switchover, how the people of a particular geographic space started thinking that we belong to a nation, the same nation. We are co-citizens. And this process, Benedict Anderson has described as print capitalism. In a sense, it was the economic response to the printing revolution that fostered print languages and then built imagined communities around them. There are various other explanations. I'm not going into the detail. I'll take another 3-4 minutes to wrap up. But there is another influential book. This is by Ernest Gellner, apart from Benedict Anderson, Nations and Nationalism, published in 1983. From another angle, it finds the critical factor in the uniform school syllabi which modern educational systems propagate through standardized languages. School education, formal education, structured education system also helps to develop national identities. Nationalism, by and large, is a continuous process of experiment. And before nationalism developed, the particular phrase expressed by Max Weber, I repeat that here again to explain the point, communities of sentiments. If you have communities of sentiments, people, a community conscious about their sentiments, about their identity, this is a kind of a prehistory of nationalism. Nationalism has a prehistory, and this prehistory is emotional history mostly. And this is where you hear about the term patriotism. Patriotism, it can coexist with political nationalism, but patriotism is an ancient term. It is in use, it is in circulation for a long time. So the sphere in which Weber located the community of sentiment is culture. When we talk about communities of sentiment, or when we talk about prehistory of nationalism, we are actually talking in cultural terms. When a cultural community assumes definite shape in a state, it becomes, in his perception, a nation. Henceforth, its sphere, by contrast, is politics. Prior to the rise of political nationalism, how does one describe these earlier and not so publicized emotions? The European vocabulary had developed a word from Latin long before the democratic nationalist revolutions in America and France. The word is patriotism. A patriot was defined in Johnson's dictionary as one whose ruling passion is the love of his country. Janoni janmobhumischo shargadopi garieshi. This is a Sanskrit sentence. It means, I'm translating it into English, it means the mother and the motherland two are greater than heaven. I give you examples. Robert Clive resorted to an ingenious use of the term patriot when he sought to persuade the banker Jagat Sheth to arrange a peace meeting between Sirajuddaulah and the English. You know, Jagat Sheth was one of the conspirators, along with Mir Jafar and others. And Robert Clive was trying to convince Jagat Sheth, the banker, to arrange a meeting between the English and Sirajuddaulah. And while he was discussing the point with Jagat Sheth, he said, I'm quoting Robert Clive, in so doing, Robert Clive is saying this to Jagat Sheth, in so doing, you will get the name of a patriot and prevent the country from being made a scene of ruin and plunder, unquote. Jagat Sheth is remembered by the Indians, and particularly the Bengalis, as a kind of a traitor. But Robert Clive is saying that if Jagat Sheth can arrange a meeting between the English and Sirajuddaulah, then he will do a great service to his nation and thereby save his nation, save his country from bloodshed. And he will be remembered as a patriot. Sirajuddaullah's notion of the love for his land was altogether different. It's very simple. He could understand and he could define the contest between our people and their people. And according to Sirajuddaulah, I'm quoting Sirajuddaulah, I will expel them. I will expel the British totally out of my country. Then patriotism, the definition of patriotism is very flexible. Patriotism, a patriot is someone who loves his motherland or fatherland, in whichever gender you put it. And the same patriotism we can find during the 5th century BC in the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta. Those of you who are familiar with the history of Greece will be able to recollect. So the term Indian nation, I'm coming to the conclusion. The term Indian nation was a foreign coinage, theoretically. But this too, despite its newness and its strong linkages with the British colonial state, was unavoidably connected with the historical evolution of identities in India. Colonialism and nationalism were linked political phenomena in the 19th and 20th centuries, Asia and Africa. But nations in the older ethnic and cultural sense of the term had existed long before the political phenomena of nationalism. What I'm trying to say in conclusion is this, that there was an existence of or awareness of India, Bharat Barsha, some kind of a cultural identity. This is some kind of a cultural identity. It may not be political nationalism. And regarding history, we have genealogy, we have dynastic history, we have chronicles, we have oral traditions. The oral traditions may be slightly tricky. It may be difficult for us to determine the exact chronology or timing, and they may be contradictory to each other. But community of sentiments, it certainly existed. It may not be political nationalism in the modern sense, but it is cultural nationalism. And we may have a perception of history as well. It is not correct to say that Indians had no sense of history. India's sense of history certainly circulated in different oral traditions and genealogies, dynastic histories, and chronicles. And we have historical texts as well, like Raj Tarangini. But this history practiced or nurtured by the Indians may be of a different nature. It may not tally with the Western perception of history. It may not tally with the white perception of history as cultivated by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The Europeans saw that there is no industrialization. In India is not industrial, it is pre-industrial. There is no full-blast capitalism in India. There is no middle class in the European sense of the term. Therefore, India has no history. India has no historical sense. India mostly depended, as you may be aware, in ancient times and in medieval times on oral tradition. Much of rural India, knowledge circulated through oral traditions. So we need to rediscover our historical perception. This is my talk is a kind of a boarding call to draw attention to young scholars so that they can start thinking in terms of an indigenous perception of history, free from Western bias. We need to explore history, Indian perception of history, and sense of indigenous history, whether indigenous history is possible and whether it existed, and whether it is possible to rummage those information from the ethnic or cultural sense or the pre-colonial context. It may be different from Western historiography, but India may have a kind of an indigenous history, a different perception of history. India did not have middle class. India did not have industrialization at that point of time, but still it was possible to nurture a kind of a historian's craft. It may be different from the West, but it does not matter. The young historians should try and explore this. I stop here. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Ranjan Chakravarti. It was really nice to listen to you, and it was a thought-provoking lecture. And you rightly pointed out that we need to learn how we discover our historicism and our nationalism. And the conclusion was very important, that there was an existence or awareness of Bharat much before the European conquest or much before the colonialism. And that is some kind of cultural identity based nationalism. So thank you so much for this. Now for the concluding remarks of today, I will invite Professor Sashibhushan Upadhyay ji.
Thank you, Dr. Tiwari. Professor Chakravarti has given a very thought-provoking lecture, extremely well presented, and covering a lot of ground, which is very pertinent to our present as well as for the further research in our universities. It has been very important in the sense that he joined these two phenomenon, intellectual phenomenon. One was historicism and another was nationalism. We tend to think that nationalism is a kind of concrete thing, something objectively given. But by joining these two, he also implicitly pointed out that nationalism, as much as historicism, has been a constructed intellectual phenomena. It's not something given. It's not something given in the sense that we derive it from the West, but then we also, as was clear in his lecture, we also had our own sense of identity in certain sense, our own sense of history. And history writing was not absent. The entire Indo-Persian texts, not only Indo-Persian texts, those are very voluminous texts which are proper history writing. But apart from that, we have these Puranic traditions, which are genealogical, but they have also a sense of history. Because the sense of history consists in the sense of change. And these Puranic traditions do pose a kind of sense of change also. Besides that, we also have many local kinds of histories which now are being attention to what we call vernacular histories in pre-colonial times, like in Assam, Odisha, even in South, in Maharashtra. In all these regions, we have local historical traditions which have been very strong, which have not been what we call scientific history in today's sense, but they have been proper histories in the sense of pre-modern histories in Europe. They resemble that, but then there have been a different kind. There has been a break when the modern history arises, say, since from Renaissance to Enlightenment, in 3-4 centuries, when the modern history actually was shaped in Europe. But before that, all histories, either in what is called West or in the East or in Africa, there were certain similarities. There might have been differences, but there were certain similarities. They were genealogical, they were oral, and they were tradition-based. So that I think is very well presented by Professor Chakravarti. Then we have this whole idea of nationalism which derived from West. And there have been writers like he mentioned Benedict Anderson and Gellner. But these writers, Max Weber, these writers have been modernists so far as their interpretation of nationalism is concerned. But there have been other writers also, particularly represented by Anthony Smith, who are what we call non-modernist writers, primordialists, what is called. And they have pointed out clearly that nationalism in some form or the other had been there earlier also. Particularly they place it in the diasporic nationalism of Jews, Greeks and Armenians. These are pre-modern kind of nationalism, what we call diasporic nationalism also, the earliest diasporic nationalisms, where we find a certain idea. Is not only patriotism, because there was no land there to defend, because patriotism is related with territoriality. While these three nationalisms were diasporic, because all developed when they were expelled from their territories. Jews were expelled in pre-Christian centuries, even in Christian centuries. Then we have Greeks and Armenians by Ottomans. So we had that nationalism which was developed by diasporas, these diasporas. So they were more than patriotic sentiments, because patriotic sentiments have always existed. As soon as there have been settled society, there have been patriotic sentiments. But these were forms of nationalism which some in one way or the other resembled what we call modern nationalism. They were very strong resemblances. So these primordialists like Anthony Smith very convincingly argue that nationalism is not entirely a 19th century and an industrial product, as Gellner makes out them to be, but they were pre-modern also in certain senses. But in the main theme of this, I think Professor Chakrabarti elaborately and comprehensively presented all aspects of it. And he very well pointed out how in Indian society also in pre-modern times, there were sentiments of, in fact, there were certain what we called the Cambridge historians, but they had moved out of the Cambridge mentality, and then they started developing different kind of histories. Like Bailey also talked about some kind of pre-nationalist things among Indian rulers, small rulers, zamindars and others, some kind of patriotism. There were others also who talk about all these things. But what Professor Chakrabarti points out is going back to the Vedas, and even seeing how this geography develops. The whole idea of India develops, starting from the Rig Veda, a kind of geographical progression takes place when more and more geographical territory is being included in the idea of India. And that is important to trace how this idea of India develops over a period of time. And that's why it became imperative that any ruler, and that is very clearly discernible in Indian history, any ruler who wants to establish an empire looks to this geographical territory in a particular way, because their geography has already been established in the pre-modern texts. So we have to see that. So I think Professor Chakrabarti has given a very thought-provoking lecture and very important lecture, and we should try to improve upon that, to follow that in the sense that our own researchers should follow that. So I thank Professor Chakrabarti for being with us, and thank you very much. Over to Dr. Sushil.
Thank you, sir. As we all know, Professor Sasibhushan Upadhyay ji has written a voluminous work on historiography. I think, if I'm correct, that book name is Historiography of the Modern World. It is from Oxford University Press, and it is a really great scholarly work. So it was very nice to you also with us today, sir. And you rightly pointed out that we have to go to the Puranic and Vedic traditions also. And from there we can derive the real Indian identity. And Professor Ranjan Chakrabarti, sir, is also a well-known scholar. So many books he written. And as you rightly pointed out, Professor Upadhyay, sir, that he elaborate comprehensively the historicism and the national identity and the colonialist thought-provoking systems on that things. So thank you so much, sir. Now this is the time for concluding. After the concluding hours, the time for औपचारिक धन्यवाद ज्ञापन, और मैं सुरेश गुहे जी से अनुरोध करता हूं कि आज का औपचारिक धन्यवाद ज्ञापन।
जी नमस्कार। भारत की आजादी का अमृत महोत्सव के अंतर्गत इग्नू द्वारा प्रस्तावित 75 व्याख्यानों की श्रृंखला की 37वीं कड़ी के मुख्य वक्ता और मुख्य अतिथि प्रोफेसर रंजन चक्रवर्ती जी, आप हमारे निवेदन पर आए और हमारे बीच आपने आज भारतीय राष्ट्रवाद और ऐतिहासिकता का पुनरावलोकन विषय पर अपनी बात रखी। हमें हमारे प्राचीन ज्ञान परंपरा के आधार पर अपनी राष्ट्रीयता को देखना चाहिए। ऐसे विषय पर आपने सभी पक्षों को समाहित करके अपनी बात रखी और हमें हमारे ज्ञान के क्षेत्र में वृद्धि की। आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। हम विश्वविद्यालय परिवार आपका बहुत बहुत आभारी है। आप से निवेदन है कि समय समय पर इसी तरह हमें अनुग्रहित किया करें। आज के इस व्याख्यान के लिए हमारे मार्गदर्शक और हमारे विश्वविद्यालय के माननीय कुलपति प्रोफेसर नागेश्वर राव जी, आपका मार्गदर्शन सतत हमें मिलता रहता है और आपकी ही प्रेरणा से यह 75 व्याख्यानों की श्रृंखला चल रही है। महोदय, आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। हमारे फ्रीडम स्ट्रगल एंड डायस्पोरा स्टडीज के डायरेक्टर और माननीय समकुलपति प्रोफेसर सत्यकाम जी, आपके निर्देशन में यह व्याख्यान श्रृंखला चल रही है। आप समय समय पर विषय विशेषज्ञों को, विद्वानों को, प्रोफेसर्स को हमारे बीच लेकर आते हैं और हमारे ज्ञान में हमारे ऐतिहासिकता को पुनरावलोकन करके देखने में हमारा ज्ञानवर्धन आप कराते रहते हैं। ऐसे प्रोफेसर सत्यकाम जी, आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। विश्वविद्यालय परिवार के समकुलपति गणों में प्रोफेसर आरपी दास जी, प्रोफेसर सुमित्रा कुकरेती जी, प्रोफेसर उमा कांजीलाल जी, आप लोगों का बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। आपके सतत सहयोग से यह कार्यक्रम लगातार चल रहा है। हम आपके बहुत बहुत आभारी हैं। हमारे आज के व्याख्यान के समाहार हेतु सामाजिक विज्ञान विद्यापीठ के प्रोफेसर शशिभूषण उपाध्याय जी, आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। आपने प्रोफेसर रंजन चक्रवर्ती जी द्वारा जो आज का व्याख्यान दिया गया है उसको सटीक बिंदुओं पर आपने समाहर्त आज प्रस्तुत किया। आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। विश्वविद्यालय के अन्य विद्यापीठों एवं इकाइयों के निदेशकगण, क्षेत्रीय केंद्रों के निदेशक महोदयगण और विश्वविद्यालय परिवार के सभी प्रोफेसर गण, आपका बहुत बहुत आभार, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। आज के कार्यक्रम में आपने सहभागिता की, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। विश्वविद्यालय परिवार के कुल सचिव महोदय, उपकुल सचिव, सहायक कुल सचिव और सभी विश्वविद्यालय परिवार के सदस्य जो भी इस आभासी माध्यम से जुड़े हैं, सबका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। आज के कार्यक्रम को ज्ञान दर्शन, यूट्यूब, फेसबुक पर प्रसारित करने वाली टीम का बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। फ्रीडम स्ट्रगल एंड डायस्पोरा स्टडीज सेंटर के सभी कर्मचारीगण, सबका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। इस कार्यक्रम के संचालन में तकनीकी टीम के संजय जी और उनकी टीम को बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। आज के कार्यक्रम को संचालन करने के लिए सुमधुर वाणी के साथ डॉक्टर सुशील तिवारी जी का बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत आभार। नमस्कार।
धन्यवाद डॉक्टर सुरेश गोहे जी। Professor Ranjan Chakravarti sir, there is a small request on the behalf of IGNOU and on the behalf of Center for Freedom Struggle and Diaspora Studies. Actually, we are planning to publish all these lectures in a book form. So if you can please provide us the written format of your paper. You can take your time. I will personally connect with you through email and through mobile and through your residential phones. But you please take care and please provide us. This is a very humble request on behalf of Center. And thank you so much for coming, sir. आशा है आगे भी हम बुलाएंगे तो आप जरूर आएंगे.
Thank you.
So अब हमेशा की तरह हम कार्यक्रम के अंतिम चरण में पहुंच चुके हैं और कार्यक्रम का समापन हम राष्ट्रगान से करते हैं। तो आप सबसे मेरा विनम्र अनुरोध है कि राष्ट्रगान के सम्मान में अपने स्थान पर खड़े हो जाएं और संजय जी से अनुरोध है कि राष्ट्रगान का संचालन करें।